Padre Pio saw something no one else could. When Giovanna approached the communion rail in San Giovanni Rotondo, the mystic priest with bleeding hands looked into her soul and recoiled. No explanation, no mercy, just denial. She walked away trembling, her body already beginning its countdown. 72 hours later, she was dead. This is not a story about faith. This is an investigation into what happens when divine sight reveals the one truth we spend our lives hiding. The morning light filtered through the ancient stained glass windows of San Giovanni Rotondo, casting fractured colors across the stone floor where Giovanna stood among dozens of faithful believers. She had risen before dawn, dressed in her finest clothes, traveled hours through winding mountain roads with her husband and children sleeping in the back seat, all for this singular moment of spiritual communion. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her rosary beads, worn smooth from years of desperate prayer during her children's illnesses, during the long nights when money ran short, during every crisis that had shaped her 36 years of life into a mosaic of suffering and devotion. The air inside the church hung thick with incense and anticipation, each breath carrying the weight of collective longing, the massed desire of people who had come seeking something beyond the material world's cruel indifference. She watched Padre Pio move slowly along the communion rail, his movements deliberate and measured, those famous stigmata wounds visible on his hands as he distributed the sacred host to each waiting mouth. Every person who received communion seemed transformed in that instant, their faces illuminated by something Giovanna desperately wanted to experience herself, a peace that seemed to emanate from the priest's very presence. When her turn came, Giovanna stepped forward with her head bowed in the traditional posture of humility, her heart hammering against her ribs, with such force she thought surely everyone could hear it echoing through the sacred space. She opened her mouth slightly, closed her eyes, prepared herself for the moment of divine connection she had anticipated for months since planning this pilgrimage. The silence stretched impossibly long, seconds expanding into eternities as she waited for the familiar weight of the host on her tongue. But nothing came. Instead, she felt the displacement of air as Padre Pio moved past her without a word, without explanation, without even the courtesy of acknowledgement. Her eyes snapped open in confusion, watching his weathered hand extend to the person beside her, continuing the sacred ritual as if she simply did not exist. The shock paralyzed her completely, rooting her feet to the cold stone floor, while her mind raced through every possible explanation, cycling desperately through her recent confessions, her private thoughts, her secret fears, searching for whatever transgression could have marked her as unworthy. Around her, she felt the weight of curious stares, felt the collective intake of breath from witnesses to this unprecedented rejection, felt the burning shame creeping up her neck and flooding her face with crimson heat. Padre Pio's eyes had met hers for one terrible instant before he turned away, and in that fraction of a second, Giovanna had seen something that would haunt her remaining days. His gaze held no anger, no judgment in the conventional sense, but rather a profound sadness mixed with what appeared to be fear or perhaps warning. Those deep-set eyes, legendary for seeing beyond the veil of human pretense into the actual substance of souls, had looked into her and seen something that made him recoil from offering her the sacred host. She stumbled backward from the communion rail, her legs suddenly weak beneath her, her vision swimming with tears she refused to let fall in this public space. The other parishioners parted around her like water around a stone, their expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity to barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing another's spiritual humiliation. She forced herself to walk with dignity back to her pew, each step requiring monumental effort as her body seemed to understand something her conscious mind still rejected. Sitting down beside her confused husband, she stared straight ahead at the altar, watching Padre Pio complete the communion service with mechanical precision, unable to comprehend why this man renowned for his compassion and spiritual insight had singled her out for this devastating rejection. The Mass concluded with prayers that sounded like mockery to Giovanna's ringing ears, words about mercy and forgiveness and divine love that seemed to specifically exclude her from their promise. She watched families gather their children and exit the church in that peculiar hushed reverence that follows religious services, watched them step into the bright Italian sunlight that now seemed obscenely cheerful, given the darkness consuming her thoughts. Her husband touched her arm gently. His weathered face creased with concern, but she shook her head mutely, unable to articulate the magnitude of what had just occurred. They remained seated long after the church emptied, the space gradually filling with that particular quality of silence found only in ancient places of worship, a silence that felt less like peace and more like judgment. Giovanna's mind kept returning to that moment when Padre Pio's eyes had locked with hers, kept replaying the expression she had seen there, kept trying to decode what hidden knowledge had prompted such an absolute refusal. She had heard stories, of course, whispers about how the stigmatist priest could see sins written on souls like text on pages, could discern spiritual corruption invisible to ordinary perception, but she had always dismissed such tales as exaggeration or superstition. Now, sitting in the empty church with afternoon shadows lengthening across the floor, Giovanna felt the first physical manifestation of what would become her final illness. A subtle nausea rolled through her stomach. A faint dizziness that made the painted saints on the walls seem to swim and shift in her peripheral vision. She pressed her palm against her forehead, finding her skin slightly clammy despite the warmth of the day, feeling the beginning of what she initially dismissed as stress or anxiety. Her husband suggested they find lodging for the night rather than attempting the long drive home, and she agreed without argument, too exhausted suddenly to do anything but follow his gentle guidance out of the church. As they stepped into the late afternoon light, Giovanna glanced back once at the church doors, half expecting to see Padre Pio standing there with some explanation, some reassurance that would make sense of her rejection. But the doorway stood empty, and she turned away feeling as though she had been expelled not just from communion, but from grace itself, cast out into a world that suddenly felt colder and more hostile than it had just hours before. That night, in their modest hotel room, while her husband and children slept peacefully, Giovanna lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind obsessively replaying every detail of the morning's events. She examined her conscience with brutal honesty, cataloguing every sin she could remember committing, every unkind thought, every moment of pride or envy or anger. She had been faithful to her husband, devoted to her children, regular in her prayers and confessions, generous with the little money they had to spare. What could Padre Pio have possibly seen that warranted such public rejection? The question consumed her like slow fire, burning away sleep and peace and rational thought until only raw terror remained. She found herself touching her own face, her own hands, as if she might discover some mark or stain that would explain everything, some visible sign of the invisible corruption the priest had detected. Her body felt foreign to her now, potentially harboring some spiritual disease she couldn't identify or understand, a contamination so severe that contact with the sacred host would have been dangerous or impossible. As dawn approached and her family began to stir, Giovanna realized with growing horror that she couldn't simply return home and resume her normal life without answers, couldn't live knowing that a man renowned for his connection to the divine had looked at her soul and found it so repugnant he refused her the most basic sacrament. The second day began with Giovanna insisting they remain in San Giovanni Rotondo, despite her husband's protests about work obligations and the children's school schedules. She needed answers, needed to understand what hidden flaw Padre Pio had seen that remained invisible to everyone else, including herself. After breakfast, she left her family at the hotel and returned alone to the church, finding it nearly empty in the mid-morning lull between services, the vast space echoing with the footsteps of a few elderly women lighting candles before the side altars. She approached one of the younger priests she had seen assisting during yesterday's Mass, a thin man with kind eyes, who was arranging flowers near the statue of the Virgin Mary. Her voice came out hoarse and uncertain as she introduced herself and explained what had happened, describing Padre Pio's refusal in clinical detail while omitting the emotional devastation it had caused. The young priest listened with an expression of practiced sympathy, his hands continuing their work with the flowers as she spoke, occasionally nodding in a way that suggested he had heard similar stories before from other rejected supplicants. When she finished her account, the priest offered explanations that felt hollow, even as he spoke them, suggesting that perhaps she had misunderstood the situation, that maybe Padre Pio had simply been tired or distracted, that the older priest's eyesight was failing, and he might not have seen her properly. These reassurances slid off the surface of Giovanna's fear without penetrating, because she knew with absolute certainty what she had witnessed in that brief moment of eye contact. The young priest suggested she attend confession that afternoon, implied gently that perhaps there was some unconfessed sin weighing on her conscience that required absolution before she could receive communion. She agreed immediately, desperately, willing to undergo any ritual that might erase whatever spiritual stain had marked her as unworthy. The hours until the confession time dragged with agonizing slowness as she paced the church grounds, watching other pilgrims arrive with their expressions of hope and devotion. Feeling increasingly isolated from the community of faith she had always considered herself part of. Her body felt heavier somehow, her movements requiring more effort than usual, a persistent low-grade headache establishing itself behind her eyes like the beginning of fever. The confessional booth smelled of old wood and countless whispered sins, the darkness inside it, both comforting and suffocating as Giovanna knelt and began the ritual phrases. She poured out every transgression she could remember or imagine, confessing not just to actual sins but to tendencies and thoughts and possibilities, scraping the bottom of her conscience for anything that might explain Padre Pio's rejection. The priest on the other side of the screen listened patiently through the latticed barrier, occasionally prompting her with questions that grew increasingly specific and uncomfortable. Had she been faithful to her marriage vows? Had she harbored hatred or wished harm on anyone? Had she engaged in any occult practices or superstitions? To each question she answered honestly, feeling her own innocence become suspect under this interrogation, wondering if perhaps she had committed sins so subtle or unconscious that she couldn't even identify them herself. When she finally exhausted her catalogue of potential transgressions, the priest assigned her a penance that seemed almost insultingly minor, given the magnitude of her spiritual crisis. A few prayers, some acts of charity, nothing that could possibly address whatever corruption had prompted a mystical saint to refuse her communion. Emerging from the confessional into the late afternoon light, Giovanna felt no lighter, no cleansed, only more confused and increasingly frightened. The fever she had initially dismissed was becoming harder to ignore, a heat building in her core that made her clothes feel too tight and her skin too sensitive. She returned to the hotel and found her husband and children eating dinner, their normalcy striking her as almost offensive in its obliviousness to her crisis. They ate in near silence as she picked at her food, unable to swallow more than a few bites before her stomach rebelled, unable to engage with her children's chatter about the town's sights and shops. Her husband's concerned questions met with vague reassurances she didn't believe herself, promises that she just needed rest, that everything would be fine once they returned home tomorrow. But she knew with a certainty that bypassed rational thought that nothing would be fine, that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with the divine or with her own body or perhaps with reality itself. The hotel room felt too small and too large simultaneously, the walls pressing in, while vast distances seemed to separate her from her sleeping family. The second night was worse than the first, her body temperature climbing noticeably now, sheets becoming damp with sweat that smelled wrong somehow, acidic and unfamiliar. She drifted in and out of feverish dreams where Padre Pio's face loomed enormous and terrible, his eyes boring into her with that mixture of sadness and fear, his bleeding hands reaching toward her but never quite touching, maintaining always that crucial distance that communion had required, and he had refused. In her delirium she imagined she could see what he had seen, some dark thing coiled around her heart or lungs or soul, some parasite or corruption feeding on her from within, invisible to ordinary sight but blazing obvious to those with spiritual vision. She woke repeatedly gasping, her heart racing, her hands clutching at her chest as if she could physically extract whatever poison had marked her as untouchable. Her husband woke with her eventually, his alarm growing as he felt the heat radiating from her skin, suggested they find a doctor or return home immediately where they could seek proper medical care. She refused both options with an intensity that surprised them both. insisting that what ailed her couldn't be treated by ordinary medicine, that the answers she needed existed only here in San Giovanni Rotondo, only in understanding what Padre Pio had seen. Morning arrived with merciful slowness, grey light seeping through curtains to reveal Giovanna's haggard face in the bathroom mirror, dark circles beneath her eyes, skin pale except for the feverish flush on her cheeks. She dressed with trembling hands, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated, her body responding slowly to her brain's commands, as if some crucial connection was fraying. Her husband begged her to stay in bed, to rest, to let him find a doctor, but she pushed past him with an obsessive determination that frightened him more than her physical symptoms. She had to speak to Padre Pio directly, had to hear from his own lips what he had seen, what invisible sin or corruption had prompted such absolute rejection. The walk to the church felt like traversing impossible distances, her legs weak beneath her, her vision occasionally blurring at the edges, but she forced herself forward through sheer will, driven by the terrible need to understand what was happening to her before it was too late. The church bells were ringing for morning mass as she approached, their sound reverberating through her fever-addled brain like accusations, like warnings, like the tolling that traditionally announces someone's approaching end. The church was crowded again for the morning mass, bodies packed into pews and standing in the aisles, all these faithful souls seeking grace and blessing from a priest renowned for his connection to divine mysteries. Giovanna wedged herself into a corner near the front, positioning herself where Padre Pio would have to see her, where she could catch his eye and somehow communicate the desperation consuming her more thoroughly than any fever. Her body swayed slightly as she stood, the fever making the painted ceiling above seem to pulse and breathe, the faces of saints and angels watching her with what might have been pity or judgment or complete indifference. She watched Padre Pio enter from the sacristy, moving with that same measured deliberation, his aged body carrying itself with dignity despite obvious pain from the wounds that had marked him for decades. During the service, she found herself unable to follow the familiar rhythms of prayer. Her lips moving soundlessly through responses, her fevered brain couldn't quite organize. Her attention fixated entirely on the priest's face, searching for some sign of recognition or compassion or explanation. When communion time approached, Giovanna felt her heart rate accelerate to the point of pain, felt sweat break out across her entire body despite the church's relative coolness, felt every muscle tense with the terrible anticipation of what was about to occur. She had positioned herself strategically in the communion line, ensuring she would approach Padre Pio from an angle where he couldn't possibly miss seeing her, where their eyes would have to meet before he made his decision. The line moved forward with agonizing slowness, each step bringing her closer to either absolution or a second rejection that would confirm her worst fears about the state of her soul. Other communicants received their host with serene expressions, mouths opening and closing in the ancient rhythm of consumption and incorporation, taking the sacred into themselves in a way Giovanna desperately needed, but might be forever denied. Her hands were shaking violently now, her entire body trembling with fever and fear, and the accumulated weight of 2 days without answers, 2 days of spiritual exile and growing physical illness that seemed connected to her rejection in ways she couldn't articulate but felt with absolute certainty. She stepped forward when her turn came, meeting Padre Pio's eyes with a look of such raw pleading that several witnesses would later describe it as heartbreaking, as the expression of someone drowning and grasping for the last possible salvation. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the priest's gaze held hers, and in that exchange Giovanna saw again what she had seen before, that profound sadness, that terrible knowledge, that suggestion of warning rather than condemnation. His hand rose with the host, and hope flared in her chest like sudden flame, the possibility that yesterday's rejection had been some mistake or test, that she had now somehow passed through her suffering and persistence. But the hand stopped mid-motion, hovering in the air between them, and she watched his expression shift into something that looked almost like regret mixed with fear, as if he was afraid of what might happen if he completed the gesture. The hand withdrew, the moment passed, and once again Padre Pio moved to the next person in line, leaving Giovanna standing there with her mouth still open in anticipation, her body beginning to understand what her mind still desperately rejected. This second rejection broke something fundamental in Giovanna's psyche, some core belief in her own goodness or worthiness or basic human value. She didn't cry or protest or demand explanation, simply turned and walked mechanically back down the aisle toward the church entrance, her face blank with shock. Her body moving on autopilot, while her consciousness seemed to hover somewhere above or beside her physical form. Behind her, she heard whispers starting to spread through the congregation like wildfire, heard her name being spoken by people who shouldn't have known it, heard theories and judgments being passed about what terrible sin she must have committed to warrant such unprecedented double rejection from a living saint. The morning sunlight outside the church doors struck her like a physical blow, too bright and too warm for her fevered skin, and she staggered slightly before catching herself against the stone wall. Her husband appeared from somewhere, having followed her to Mass despite her insistence on going alone. His face creased with worry and confusion as he tried to understand what was happening to his wife, why she was being treated this way by a church and priest they had traveled so far to honor. The rest of that day dissolved into a fever dream blur of returning to the hotel room, of her husband's increasing alarm at her deteriorating condition, of her own obsessive muttering about what Padre Pio had seen, what invisible corruption marked her soul as untouchable. She could feel her body failing now in ways that went beyond simple illness, as if the spiritual rejection had somehow translated into physical consequences, as if being denied access to the sacred had initiated some process of decay or dissolution. Her husband wanted to call for a doctor, wanted to load her into the car and drive to the nearest hospital, but she refused with the last remnants of her strength, insisting that no earthly physician could cure what ailed her, that the diagnosis and treatment she needed existed in realms beyond medical science. In her more lucid moments, she wondered if perhaps Padre Pio's refusal had been not rejection, but protection, if perhaps he had seen that her soul was so corrupted that contact with the holy would destroy her rather than redeem her. This thought terrified her more than any other, the possibility that she had been walking through life, carrying some spiritual poison she was completely unaware of, some contamination that marked her as dangerous to herself and potentially to others. Evening brought a slight reduction in her fever, but an increase in her existential terror, a clarity born of exhaustion that allowed her to see her situation with devastating objectivity. She had been rejected twice by a man renowned for his ability to see souls in their true state, rejected publicly, in front of witnesses who would carry stories of her unworthiness back to their own communities and congregations. Whatever Padre Pio had seen in her, it was severe enough to override all Christian principles of mercy and compassion, severe enough to risk public scandal and criticism, severe enough to leave a mother of young children spiritually exiled. She thought about her children sleeping peacefully in the next bed, innocent and pure, and wondered with growing horror if whatever corruption she carried might be transmissible, might already be affecting them through her maternal care and love. Her husband sat beside her bed holding her hand, his calloused palm wrapped around her fevered fingers, and she looked at him with profound guilt, wondering what invisible damage she might have caused this good man who had loved her faithfully for 15 years without knowing the true nature of the woman he had married. The night deepened and Giovanna felt something shift inside her body, some final barrier giving way, some last defense crumbling against the combined assault of fever and spiritual despair, and the simple inability of human flesh to sustain itself under such conditions. She knew with sudden certainty that she was dying, not from any identifiable disease, but from the mysterious connection between spiritual state and physical health, from the feedback loop between rejection and decay. She tried to speak to her husband, tried to explain what she was feeling, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her words jumbling together in ways that made her sound delirious, even to her own ears. He leaned close, promising her everything would be fine, that they would go home tomorrow and see doctors and priests and figure out what was happening. But she could see in his eyes that he was terrified, that he understood on some level that his wife was slipping away towards some destination he couldn't follow. The hotel room seemed to darken around its edges, shadows gathering in corners and pooling beneath furniture, as if night itself was seeping in to claim her, as if the spiritual darkness Padre Pio had detected was finally becoming visible, even to ordinary sight in these final hours.